What's good, YouTube? I just got done writing up and finalizing all of the dungeon guides for all of the dungeons going into Season 2 in Dragonflight. I'll be releasing these videos on the build up to the second season, so keep an eye out for those in the coming weeks. But now that I've got a better understanding of all the dungeons for next season, I thought I'd do up a little tier list and rank the ones that I'm most looking forward to and the ones that I'm gonna try and stay clear of. So as you can see here, I've got all the dungeons listed below that are in the pool for next season. And I'm gonna freestyle this, like I don't know where I'm putting these dungeons into what tier before the video. So I'm just gonna go with the flow and see where we end up. So then, we'll start with the Underrot. I think for this dungeon, I'm going to start by whacking this one in the A tier. I am actually a massive fan of this dungeon back from BFA, although I do feel like people do forget the troubles that this dungeon had. I think a better way of saying it is it feels like a really nice dungeon to play, but it definitely has some core mechanics that are definitely wrong with the dungeon. Cragmore being one of them, this boss scaled disgustingly on high tyrannicals. During the tantrum phase, you'd have to commit every defensive under the sun and all your healing cooldowns just to survive it. But obviously, it still definitely was doable. It was just one of those sticking points in the key where if you got past there, you could probably time the key, but it was definitely a pug killer for sure. Another problem with this dungeon is that if you run it from start to finish, I think you end up with like 130% mob count or something stupid like that. And it's a very linear dungeon at that as well. So you have to find weird ways to skip, and it almost made rogues mandatory back in the day. And then obviously we had that seasonal affix where we were able to skip a lot of mobs with the actual pillars that we went inside of. So we'll see how that plays out with obviously not having a seasonal affix this season for Season 2. But outside of that, I really do enjoy this dungeon. I think it's got a lot of cool and unique mechanics. For example, I really like the third boss, even though that is definitely a pug killer as well. The first boss is kind of easy, but hey, we never complain about that. And I guess to be fair, in Cragmore's room, if you're feeling confident enough that you can kill it quick enough, then you probably can skip a bit of trash in there. But I would always advise just clearing it all to be safe. So yeah, I think the Underrot deserves its spot in A, although I feel like maybe it could also be a B tier dungeon as well. But I mean, I'm going to enjoy it, I know that for a fact. But yeah, like I said, it just has some core mechanics that are definitely flawed with the dungeon, that had like a band-aid over them. For example, when I talked about the seasonal affix that we are able to skip a lot of the dungeon with, there's not a ridiculous amount of kicks in this dungeon, which I think is always a good thing in Mythic Plus. And most importantly, for me at least anyway, a short dungeon is a good dungeon. Like, you don't want to be committing 40-50 minutes to a bloody dungeon. You want 30 minutes in and out. If you brick it, you brick it. It's only 30 minutes that you've wasted compared to like 40, 50 plus. So that is a massive factor for me in rating it a lot higher, is because I just think Blizzard should stick to the shorter dungeons with mobs that don't have 18 kicks that you have to assign every single pack. And then the dungeons are good. So yeah, I'm happy with the A for Underrot at the moment. Next, we'll move on to the Vortex Pinnacle, which is obviously a new one coming back from Cataclysm. If you're enjoying the video, please consider hitting that subscribe button. And I think a lot of people were skeptical about this dungeon, but from what I've played on the PTR of this dungeon, and I've written up my own guide because there's not that much information out there, I'm actually kind of excited for this dungeon. So I think I'm going to put this one in A as well. I do think it could have a little bit more mechanics actually added to some of the mobs, and specifically the bosses in here. Like, the bosses are pretty lackluster. They don't really do anything. But these are the kind of mechanics that you wouldn't need weak auras for, because obviously Blizzard at the moment are trying to get rid of weak auras, basically. They don't want them in the game. So these dungeons with simpler mechanics, but they hit hard, I think is the way to go forward. Same again for the trash. There's not a million kicks that you have to interrupt. There's a few cyclones that you have to interrupt. Towards the end of the dungeon, you've got a few greater heals that you need to assign kicks for. But it's not like every single pack has 5 kicks, like I said, that you need to assign one player in your group for every single time, and if you miss one, the key's over. Missing kicks shouldn't be the end of your key. It should just add a few seconds or minutes over the course of a dungeon. Like, it shouldn't wipe you. It should just add time to your key instead, so that you fail by the timer instead of missing, say, a Mystic Blast in Alcthar Academy just to pluck one out of random. But yeah, I'm pretty optimistic for this dungeon. There's not a plethora of mobs as well. Like, a lot of the mobs you see quite frequently through the dungeon as well. I like the idea as well. They're a bit gimmicky, those mobs, the Lurking Tempests. But I kind of like the idea of like weird stuff like that, where you don't have to actually attack the mobs. You just have to interact with them in like a weird outside of the box way. So I think this dungeon's actually cleaned up pretty nicely. In fact, I've kind of taught myself into moving it above Underrot. I wasn't going to rank these within the tiers, but we're doing that now, so that's how it's going, all right? The first boss could scale a bit wacky, I think, especially with the tornadoes. Like, once you're outside of those, you're going to have to pop your defensives, and at high tyrannical keys, that could scale absolutely ridiculously. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Second boss, not many mechanics, but you can be punished. For example, if you don't have the speed buff and then you get caught by the chilling breath, that can definitely be fatal. And then obviously the last boss, we're going to have to also see how all these different bosses interact with the different affixes as well. But generally, I do think this could be a great Mythic Plus dungeon. And again, like I said, it's a short dungeon. So we don't have to commit an hour if we're depleting the key. We don't have to commit 40 minutes if we're just timing it by the skin of our teeth and have to play out of our mind for 40 minutes. Instead, if we play out of our minds, we might be able to finish it within 20 or 25 minutes, which I think is muy bueno for Mythic Plus. You're going to be hearing a lot of this during this tier list, by the way. Okay, on to Dragonflight Hollow. I think, personally, this dungeon could be great if tuned correctly. The one problem that's holding it back is the fact that it's a long dungeon and it's also a massive space, although I don't think that matters too much all in all. But the way it's tuned at the moment, it's quite frankly terrifying. I don't know if you guys have watched any of the content for the PTR on like Twitch or anything, twitch.tv/VesperalTV. But for example, the first boss, that little council boss, seems absolutely ridiculous. Like, I think it's something like for every 10% health you lose, they gain a 10% stacking haste buff, which is just ridiculous with like the casts that go through. And then the rogue type mob that just jumps around your whole group and ambushes them for all of their health. Like, it's pretty ridiculous at this point. But I like the idea of like specifically the starting area where you can kind of choose where you want to go, what mobs you want to kill. You got to do a little bit of RP freeing the Tuskar. I think that's quite cool in a dungeon setting. And it also doesn't take too long. But yeah, I think the bosses are cool in their design. They just need to tune accordingly and get it as close to perfect as they can. Because then I think this dungeon could actually be pretty good. I think people are honestly terrified of this dungeon for good reason as well from what we've seen. But they have made some changes, some good changes at that. So hopefully in a month's time when the dungeons actually release, it will be in a good spot. And saying that, there needs to be a lot of work on that last boss, because on tyrannical keys, that boss is going to kill your key. It's just a fact at this point. So for the Dragonflight Hollow, I think I'm going to bang this one in C tier at the moment. I know there's probably a few people that would place it in D, but there's also people that would place it higher. So we're going to go safe. We're going to go in the middle here. I think as long as they get the scaling right, then we should be chilling. They just need to tune a few mobs here and there. I like the fact that no matter your class, you can actually cleanse that withering debuff at the start because of the pots or whatever it is around the start of the dungeon and throughout the dungeon as well. So you can actually keep on top of that. You don't have to rely on a healer with a disease dispel, I think it is. Or is it a poison? I actually can't remember, but I know it's something called, it's called like withering or something like that. So I like the fact that that's been added so that we're not locked into a comp, because that is never good for Mythic Plus. Like, we want to see a variety of classes and specs able to complete these keys at the highest level possible. So yeah, we're going to lock this one in C for now. On to the fan favorite then, is Freehold. Of course it is. So I think this one does deserve its spot in S tier, just like even just from the excitement of the players for having this dungeon back in the pool, and for good reason as well. Like, you have so many options for what you want to pull in this dungeon. It's very open, it's not linear at all. Like, you can get really creative with the routing for this dungeon, doing skips here and there. However, we do have to remember with these BFA dungeons, we did get to play them when we had that skipping seasonal affix. So it will be interesting to see how it plays out now. Like, a rogue could be mandatory for the highest of keys, not that they already aren't, of course, but yeah, we might see a lot of rogues in the high keys just to allow for those optimal pulls to be pulled off without going over count. And another one of my criteria for a massively successful dungeon is massive pulls. Who doesn't like a massive pull? Like in Season 1, if Alcathar Academy didn't have the massive pulls that it had, I don't think people would rate it as highly as they do. Big AoE is fun, Blizzard. Just please let us do big AoE. Stop putting a gazillion amount of kicks in every pack, not allowing us to do massive pulls and nuke it all down together, because that is fun, and that is why we play the game. There we go. So yeah, in Freehold, you can do massive pulls all the time. It's a lot of fun. There are some kicks that you do need to take care of. I'm thinking like the Frost Blast in the second area, but there's not a ridiculous amount that if you pull it all, you're definitely going to wipe. You can for sure handle it if you play well. Again, another tick for the criteria. Short dungeon. I think in the PTR we have been like memeing around a bit with the affixes and level of key and that, but we've been completing it in like 18 minutes. So like that is the sign of a good dungeon in my opinion. If you can commit like 20 to 30 minutes, I sound like a broken record, to a dungeon and complete it in that time, that is muy bueno. People don't have time to sit around spending 40 minutes in keys all day and depleting them as well. It just does not work for the casual player base at all. So make the dungeons shorter. There is one thing, like I was debating putting this in the top of A tier, but I think I'll get crucified for it if people actually saw that. So I'm keeping it in S. But there is one thing with Freehold that was not ideal, to say the least, and it's the way the bosses scaled, specifically on tyrannical keys. Some of the unavoidable damage in these bosses just started one-shotting people at a certain level of key, and obviously that's not a big deal to the majority of the player base. But that is also the fun in pushing these high keys, is testing the limits and see what you can survive. But when you can't do anything about a one-shot mechanic, it just feels horrible. Like, I can understand one-shot mechanics if they've got like a big charge up, they're visible and all that good stuff, because then you can play accordingly and pop a defensive, pop an immunity, or whatever it is you want to do. But when a powder shot is coming out every 3 seconds and just one-shotting one member of your group every 3 seconds, and you cannot avoid it at all unless you find some weird cheese for it, that is not good. So hopefully Blizzard take that into account and tune this correctly. I know for at least some of the dungeons that they've brought back, they do seem to tune them and scale them differently. So hopefully they've taken on the feedback that they got back in BFA and sort out these unavoidable one-shots so that it's more enjoyable. Ultimately, that's my only gripe with this dungeon, honestly. Like, the rest of it is pretty much perfect. There is obviously going to be a few things that certain people don't like, but that is why it deserves its spot in S tier. It is definitely probably the best dungeon going into next season. Spoiler alert. But yeah, Freehold is good for all of those reasons I just listed. Another spicy dungeon here, we have Older Man, Legacy of Tyr. Again, don't know where I'm putting this. I'm going to kind of think of the negatives and positives as we go and then place it accordingly. But to start off, it seems like Older Man honestly has quite a lot of big and fun pulls. So that, in my books, is a positive, especially in the first area of the dungeon. Like, you can pull big and get away with it, nuke them all down, big AoE damage, big fun. It also has that nostalgia, classic-esque feel to it, so that's going to be welcoming for a lot of players. I know personally I'm looking forward to it as well. I did used to love the Older Man dungeons. And also generally the bosses aren't too difficult if you delete the last boss from the dungeon. I really enjoy the dwarf boss. The Trog boss is good as well. Emberon, I think it's called. He's a good boss as well. I think the snake boss could get a bit spicy at some point. So the snake boss and the last boss are going to be the ones to look out for on your tyrannical keys. But generally, the other bosses are pretty fun. Like, Emberon's kind of got that Agrimar vibe from Legion, was it? A lot of people enjoyed that back in the day, so that's nice to bring that sort of mechanic back. And speaking of bosses, you're going to be having a lot of people farming this dungeon for that Talon. For example, Arcane Mages were running that Talon this season at 372, so that shows you how ridiculous this is going to be, and that trinket alone could warrant Arcane Mage being S tier by itself. So whatever classes are going to utilize that trinket well are going to be spending a lot of time in here unless you get lucky, which I think is quite cool. Like, I feel like each dungeon should have its own great piece of loot that people want to run it for. I mean, looking at the list so far, Freehold's got the loaded dice, Underrot has got the Krog Tusks. Don't know about Vortex Pinnacle, don't know about Brackenhide, but yeah, Older Man's obviously got the Talon, so that's exciting for a lot of classes. You've got Halls of Infusion has got the Iridius Fragment, which is going to be broken for a lot of classes as well. I think that's generally quite good. As long as it's spread evenly across the dungeons generally, then it's quite exciting to have one piece of loot that you're going for from these dungeons specifically. And then additionally, on the boss front, obviously there is 5 bosses in this dungeon, which is a very, very long dungeon on a tyrannical week for sure. So we'll have to see how that pans out, because at a high level of key, spending 4 minutes on 5 different bosses, that's not going to be a great time, just single targeting the whole time. So we'll have to see what's good with that. I don't know if we've actually ever had 5 bosses in one dungeon before. That's going to be interesting. Definitely. I mean, on Fortified, it might balance itself out, because Fortified, those bosses are going to fall over, except maybe the last one. And then on Tyrannical, it's just going to be an absolute slog. So yeah, we'll have to see how that goes in the next season. Don't know if I'm looking forward to that, but I reckon I'm going to whack this one in the B tier. Older Man's one of the ones that I'm looking forward to more out of this dungeon pool. Okay, so Neltharis. Again, another dungeon that I'm looking forward to next season out of the Dragonflight dungeons. There is some room for big pulls in this dungeon, provided that you have the kicks assigned, unfortunately. And as long as Blizzard, please Blizzard, tunes the bosses correctly, then this dungeon should be a good time. I've seen Magma Tusk is a bit of a problem on PTR at the moment, so hopefully they sort that out, because it's a fun fight. It just has a ridiculous amount of outgoing damage, and it's a bit finicky with like moving the boss and getting him out of the lava pools, because sometimes he just stands there because obviously he's got such a massive hitbox. So tanks are going to have to be on form with this boss. But they've got quite a lot of unique mechanics on the bosses as well. So you've got the chain mechanic on the second boss, depending on which way you go. You've got the third boss, the Forge Master, where he goes back to the anvil and then throws out the shield. I think like these bosses are pretty cool in their design. Again, could be a bit scary with how the last boss scales, specifically with that ticking damage during the phase where you've got to search through the gold piles, and how big that shield is going to be. Like at some point, we're obviously going to have to use all of those items instead of DPSing a lot of the shield down. But yeah, I think once people get this dungeon figured out, and specifically the trash figured out with what is the priority kicks in this dungeon, I don't think it should be too bad. There is unfortunately a lot of walking time during this dungeon. It's inside, so we can't mount up either, but there is a lot of travel time in this dungeon, and you're like going back and forth on yourself. You can unlock little shortcuts here and there. But yeah, this dungeon is on the longer side. It's also quite linear. Like you don't have too much room for creativity in this dungeon. There might be a few skips here and there that we figure out along the way. But once people kind of figure out the optimal route, whether you go to the Magma Tusk boss first or the chain boss first, then it's pretty much going to be a straight line. Just hold W through the whole dungeon. And one little thing I did forget about is in this dungeon, you've got the little gimmick with the chains that you can actually use on the trash as well. So keep an eye out for those as you go through the dungeon. I do think those are pretty cool when you can utilize something in the dungeon to make the key go faster. I think that's always a positive, brings a bit of, again, like I said, creativity to the dungeon, and allows players to really think outside the box as to how you can time this key even quicker and therefore push even higher. So with that being said, I'm going to whack Neltharus in the B tier. I think I'm going to put it behind Older Man. I think it just lacks the big pulls. I am scared with Older Man. Like, the amount of bosses in this dungeon just keeps shouting out at me. And I'm thinking, is it a B tier dungeon? I don't know. We'll have to see. But it's exciting. It's something different, right? So we'll give it the benefit of the doubt and put it in B tier. I think I'm going to put Neltharus just in front, actually. I think the creativity and the unique mechanics on these bosses really brings it to life and makes me excited for this dungeon, honestly. Which, on the contrary, I am not looking forward to Halls of Infusion. I think this might be a bit too harsh to put it in D straight away. I will revisit this rating once I've spoken about it and actually put my thoughts into perspective. But yeah, I think this is the dungeon I'm least looking forward to next here, I can't lie. It is a very long dungeon, so according to a Vesp's criteria, which I've coined by the way, not good at all. Currently, it stands at a 38-minute timer, which is a lot of time to be sinking into a key, especially when it's a dungeon like this. It is also a very linear dungeon. Like, there's not really any creativity with the pools in here. Maybe we could join some pools up together. I don't know at this point. But from the outside looking in, it looks very much like you're just going to hold W through the dungeon, especially on the way out of the dungeon when you inevitably brick the key due to one of these insane bosses in here. I don't think the first boss, as in the Watcher, will be too hard, and let me tell you, warriors are going to love that boss. I don't think he's going to be too hard. The frog boss, I haven't really made my mind up either, but I don't think that one's going to be too hard. It's more so the ice boss, I think, is going to scale absolutely bonkers on Tyrannical. Like, even when you hide behind the correct pillars from her AoE, I forget what it's called, it still does a stupid amount of damage. So that's probably still just going to one-shot you, even though you're doing the mechanic right, which I think feels bad, personally. Like, you should be rewarded. Not necessarily rewarded, but you shouldn't be punished for doing a mechanic correctly. I don't know if that's just me. I feel like that would probably be a widely held opinion. And then the last boss, the clarity on some of the spells is quite difficult to see, I feel like. And also the gauntlet just sucks at the end. Like, I hate stuff like that. I didn't mind, like, the gauntlet I feel was done well in Sanguine Depths for any of you guys that played that dungeon. But this type of gauntlet where you're getting punished by the mobs, but at the same time the waves that are coming down, I don't know, I'm just really not a fan of this gauntlet at all, but maybe it will grow on me. Maybe I'm just being closed-minded for now. Who knows? Those frogs in that room after the first boss, the Watcher as well, are ones to look out for. They can definitely get very hairy, so be wary of those. And they are present during the frog boss as well. But remember that I've got dungeon guides coming for every single one of these dungeons, so keep an eye out and also subscribe for those. Again, with the Watcher, he does have the insane Iridius Fragment trinket that's going to drop. So depending... This is the problem with the great loot that I was talking about dropping from specific dungeons, is if the dungeons are good dungeons, then that is an overall W, I think. But if the dungeon is horrible and you have to farm it regardless because there's an insane item in it, people will just end up despising this dungeon anymore. So hopefully Blizzard make this dungeon a bit more fun. There's a lot of kicks at the start with the first mobs, but that's all going to come down to a priority system. And yeah, unfortunately, I just think the last boss is going to be a bit of a key bricker as well. And it feels bad when something at the end of the dungeon bricks your key. Again, ties in with the length of the dungeon as well. Temple of the Jade Serpent wasn't too bad in the first season because it was a short dungeon, but it still felt bad at the end of the dungeon when you've played flawlessly and you get to the end and that last pack or the last boss just bricks your key, and then you've wasted, or not wasted, but you've been focusing for the best part of 30, or in this case 30 plus minutes, and then it comes down to the final point, and then that is just the end of it, and then you don't get the score, you don't get the dopamine, it just doesn't feel great. Obviously it's still hard to judge at this point, but I think Halls of Infusion for me personally is definitely the one I'm least looking forward to. So I am going to leave it in the D tier, I think. I think I've taught myself into leaving it in the D tier. So sorry to any Halls of Infusion enjoyers out there, but also I'm not that sorry. And lastly, we have Neltharion's Lair, which I have a lot of experience in this dungeon. I sweated Mythic Plus back in Legion, so I have got a lot of hours sunken into this dungeon right here. It is a bit of a longer dungeon, but I personally think it's fun. I don't know if that's just tied to nostalgia, but I have a great time in here. Towards the end of Legion, we were pulling the whole of the first upstairs part together, lusting it and just nuking everything down. There's one or two scary mobs in there, but it was doable, especially with Lust, so that was fun because big pulls equal fun, like we've established. That being said, though, the first boss can definitely be scary. There is a lot of damage going out during that boss, so tyrannical weeks you're going to have to look out for. And there could definitely be some flaws with this dungeon. Like, we used to completely cheese the middle part of this dungeon, which probably in itself doesn't paint this dungeon in that good of a light, because we used to have an Affliction Warlock slow all the mobs in the middle that throw the jagged discs, because they were just one shot at a certain key level, especially on Fortified. So we would just slow those mobs, and if the tank was out of range of them, they would never cast their discs and never throw them at random players to one-shot them. So that's how we cheesed it back in the day. Hopefully they're just scaled better this time, because otherwise I have no idea how we're going to do that middle section, because that was pretty much the only way to do it, especially on high keys back in the day. You do also have some, and I'll emphasize some, routing choices with this dungeon. For instance, like I said, you can pull that whole area upstairs, or you could skip some of it, get the trash later on in the dungeon. You can get some crocodiles from inside the lake near the end before the third boss. You can skip some of the trash in the last area because that is arguably some of the hardest trash in there. So thinking about it, there is quite a lot of room for creativity in there. The more I think about it, to be fair, the bosses in this dungeon aren't that great. Like, the first boss is okay, it just does a lot of damage. The second boss is just kind of annoying because of the intermission phase where he goes underground. It's a fun little puzzle, but like when you're on a timer, something like that, where you're not actively doing damage, kind of feels bad. Third boss is a worm boss. We all know what worm bosses are like. And the last boss can be difficult, but I mean, as long as you execute the mechanics correctly, then you should kind of be fine. There is a lot of damage that goes out, but hey, healer's job, am I right? So for Neltharion's Lair, I think I'm going to go with an A tier for this bad boy. I think I'm going to place it behind these two, just because of some of the faults in the middle with like the pelters throwing those jagged discs and one-shotting your group. We'll have to see how that pans out. And some of the bosses aren't great, but the rest of the dungeon I love. And obviously, like I said, that could be a complete nostalgia hit for me because I had such a great time doing keys in Legion. But I think I'm pretty happy with that tier list overall. And isn't that crazy? The top 3 dungeons have all got short timers, would you believe it? Like, I do think I have quite a good grasp of criteria for a good dungeon. Obviously, Short timers equals good. We don't want it too short, but like I feel like the sweet spot would be 25 to 30 minutes for a key. Big pulls are also always a good time. Doing big AoE DPS and unleashing your cooldowns, your whole group's cooldowns on the pack of 20 mobs feels amazing and will never get old. Blizzard, the most fun people have had in dungeons is always the dungeons with the big pulls in it. Do the maths. Coupling with that, less kicks is more fun. I still think you can have the casts that deal a lot of damage, but maybe even just make them uninterruptible. I don't know, this is sounding like a hot take, but bear with me. But make them interruptible, never let them one-shot us. Obviously, at some point they will. But going into every pack and assigning, right, your diamond, your square, your triangle, so boring and monotonous, and if you miss one kick, that's the end of your dungeon. That just feels so bad. Just let us nuke it down, let the unavoidable damage kill us, and that will also in turn make healers have to do more healing so that they're not saying cat form the whole time. I don't know, bit of a hot take, but I think you guys sort of get where I'm going with that. Like, a lot of kicks and a lot of deadly kicks at that is never a good time. One or two here and there, or like one mob in a pack of 5 with the deadly kick that you have to prio, absolutely fine. I'm completely down with that. But when you've got 3, 4 different casts that you have to kick every time you go into a new pack, it's just not good. So yeah, this is my tier list for the dungeons going into next season of Dragonflight, Season DOS, Season 2. We'll be doing plenty more tier list. Tier list Vesp is back, so stay tuned for those. Like the video if you agree with me. Comment down below what you thought I got wrong, or maybe you thought I got it bang on the money. I don't think I said too many hot takes. I mean, maybe the Brackenide Hollow could be in D tier. Maybe Halls of Infusion could be higher. I don't know. Let me know down below. And until next time, I'll catch you guys later.